Joseph Campbell believed that everything begins with a story. So we begin this series with Joseph Campbell with one of his favorites. He was in Japan for a conference on religion, and he overheard another American delegate, a social philosopher from New York, say to a Shinto priest, "We've been now to a good many ceremonies and have seen quite a few of your shrines, but I don't get your ideology. I don't get your theology." The Japanese paused as though in deep thought, and then slowly shook his head. "I think we don't have ideology," he said. "We don't have theology. We dance." Joseph Campbell was one of the most spiritual men I ever met, but he didn't have an ideology or a theology. Mythology was to him the song of the universe, the stories and legends told by human beings through the ages to explain the universe and their place in it.
It's pure ideology. It's pure ideology.
Hi folks. In this video, I would like to talk about ideology. In doing so, I will address the difficulty we all have moving outside of ideology and what we can do about this. You can see it in the opening clip. The anecdote expresses a desire to remain free of ideology and just dance. As appealing as I find this, I must point out that Joseph Campbell certainly created an ideology, or at the very least, a lens to look at the world that can limit one's perception as much as any other. His conception of the hero's journey certainly frames stories and even people's lives in a certain way. We could therefore call it an ideology. So we must acknowledge the tension between the tools we use to steer clear of ideology and how these very tools tend to become ideologies themselves. You might have noticed the crustacean that appears on the bottom of the screen right now, the lobster, if you will. I will talk more about the moon arcana of the tarot you see on the screen later and how it relates to this topic. But for now, I will talk a bit about the head lobster himself, Jordan Peterson. Today, a lot of young men watch YouTube videos of Peterson warning them about ideology and pointing to a strengthening of the individual as an antidote to it. I have a certain sympathy for this. When YouTube first sprang up, I spent a lot of time listening to a guru tell me something very similar. Although in my case, I listened to psychedelic pioneer Terence McKenna, whose ghost haunts YouTube in the form of hours of his lectures. He certainly had some very crazy ideas, but unlike Peterson, McKenna never stirred up reactionary hysteria over his hallucinations. For all his faults, he genuinely wanted people to look to themselves to chart their own course. He never handed out any rules, though he did recommend taking large doses of psychedelic drugs in silent darkness, which, unless you have a severe mental condition, seems like some of the best self-help advice out there, though I must admit a strong bias on this issue.
Ideology is not our friend.
The thing to keep coming back to is the felt presence of immediate experience. Not how do I feel as a feminist or a Marxist or a devotee of Hieronymus Bosch or whatever. How do I feel? Period. Not through the filter of ideology. As I look back through history, as you look back through history, very few ideologies last very long without going sour or becoming toxic. So why should we assume, as all those naive societies in the past assumed, that we are, have 95% of the truth and the other 5% will be delivered by our best people in the next 3 years? Fools have always believed that, but the smart money knows we ain't even close.
I wish these kids today would look to figures like McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, and Alan Watts instead of Jordan Peterson. They understood the problems of ideology, but had a much more genuine and self-aware approach to not falling into it. Like Peterson, you can also find tons of their lectures on YouTube. While Peterson rails against ideology, at the very same time, he perpetuates one of the dominant ideologies of our time.
And then people turn to things like ideologies, which I regard as parasites on an underlying religious substructure. People could always excuse that by saying, well, that's not real communism, which is the sort of statement that should immediately get you punched in the nose hard enough to knock you out, as far as I'm concerned.
Either put on these glasses or start eating that trash can.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology. The material force of ideology makes me not see what I'm effectively eating. It's not only our reality which enslaves us. The tragedy of our predicament when we are within ideology is that when we think that we escape it into our dreams, at that point we are within ideology.
That culture and language tend to become traps, and yet they can be the platforms for enormous freedom if you understand what it's all about. And what it's all about is you.
Peterson thinks he has escaped ideology, even as he mouths the dominant ideology. Just as Zizek points out and McKenna warns, this seems the most pernicious kind of ideology, or perhaps the most pernicious thing about ideology generally. We seldom think we have an ideology. We think we see things as they are. In my experience, the people most under the sway of an ideology most confidently proclaim they don't have one. They think of themselves as merely describing the world as it is. But what do we call the dominant ideology that Peterson perpetuates? Well, as someone who holds up the status quo and holds the individual as of primary importance, we can rightly identify his political ideology as neoliberalism, or perhaps capitalist realism. You can describe neoliberalism by listing its economic and political features, but many find the best summation of neoliberalism came from Margaret Thatcher when she said, "There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families."
It is only the individual, after all, who suffers. The group does not suffer. Only those who compose it. Thus, the reality of the individual must be regarded as primary.
It's pure ideology. It's pure ideology.
The neoliberal view of the world seems to go hand in hand with Peterson's view of atomized individuals scrambling to compete against each other in dominance hierarchies. Both views discourage collective action in favor of individual action and privatization. Peterson has another quality that marks him as holding strongly to an ideology. Here we turn to the late writer and sit-down comic, or stand-up philosopher, if you will, Robert Anton Wilson.
I mean, hostile strength. I'm okay, you are not okay. And that is the favorite game of ideologists of all stripes. The person is always going around telling everybody else what's wrong with them and trying to straighten them out. Never in a kindly way like friendly strength, but always in a morally reproving way.
Especially true if you're very young, because like, what the hell do you know? You haven't done anything. Right. You're like, I tell 18-year-olds, 6 years ago you were 12. It's like, what the hell do you know? Right. You haven't, you're under the care of your family or the state. You haven't established an independent existence. You haven't had children. You haven't started a business. You haven't taken responsibility for anything. You don't have a degree. You haven't finished your courses. You don't know how to read. You can't think. You can't speak. You're ill-kempt. You don't know how to present yourself. Well, Jesus, you know.
It's pure ideology. It's pure ideology.
Wilson also had a lot to say about ideology.
Everybody has their own neurological reality tunnel, which is why we misunderstand one another so often and why we misjudge one another so profoundly. We receive, I think, more than 1 billion signals every minute from the environment. Most of them we're not even conscious of receiving. They affect our legs, our arms, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our chest. All this information is pouring in, and the nervous system is making evaluations at different levels, working its way up. If we tried to be conscious of all the signals, we couldn't do it, because to be conscious of that many signals simultaneously means we only perceive chaos. The chaos is because we can't handle that much information and organize it rapidly. So we throw out all the information that seems unimportant, which means we also throw out all the information that seems threatening to our belief system or to our dogma or to our ideology. We throw out everything we think can be ignored safely, so we concentrate on the things that seem important. Then our brain constructs a model out of all the information coming up from the rest of the nervous system, and we project the model outward and consider it reality. It's not reality, it's our reality tunnel. Everybody else in the same room is constructing a different reality tunnel. That's the way I look at psychology, sociology, and things in general, is in terms of What does this model include and what does it exclude? Nobody can make a model that includes everything, although all the dogmatists on the planet think they've done that. If you included everything, all you'd perceive is chaos.
This brings us to the moon arcana you see on the screen right now. Just as we project our own reality onto the world, in this card, we see a human face projected onto the moon. What does this result in? Well, when people hold too firmly to conflicting ideologies, they build towers like we see in the background. They fight like dogs. They remain stuck in the dominance hierarchies Peterson loves to tell us about. They stay stuck in their shells like the lobster. Hyper-individualism, armored against the outside world. Again, stuck down below in a stagnant pool, unable to rise to a more cooperative form of life and consciousness. How do we break out of this? Well, many methods exist.
Don't think. Feel. It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory. Do you understand?
But this is only one approach to breaking free from ideology. Wilson points to all manner of techniques for reprogramming. Meditation, certain kinds of yoga, psychotherapy, general semantics, and psychedelic drugs. What we are really talking about here is magic. No, please don't shut this off. I know that word usually sends a lot of people running for the hills, especially rational, skeptic, atheist types. But hear me out. The word has a very simple meaning that does not require you to subscribe to any kind of superstitious mumbo-jumbo. Unless, of course, that's your thing, then you can throw some of that in there according to your own taste if you really want to. No, Dion Fortune probably had the best definition of magic. She defined magic as the art of causing changes in consciousness in conformity with the will. Probably not the definition you expected. You have certainly engaged in some kind of consciousness-changing activity if you think about it. For instance, anyone who's taken any kind of mind-altering substance has done this, whether it is caffeine or LSD. Maybe you have experimented with yoga or meditation. Maybe you have read general semantics or some other kind of writing that makes you aware you see the world through a reality tunnel. Now, I can't go deeply into all the methods of consciousness alteration in this video. So many exist that it would take an entire video much longer than this one just to scratch the surface. I will provide some links in the description if you would like to check out some of the techniques I like. But I would like to throw out a few approaches that I think fit in the context of this video. Terence McKenna and Bruce Lee both invite us to not think about things too much and to just feel. I think this technique has both merits and limits. I find it useful to get out of your head and do something physical. I practice Baguazhang, an internal Chinese martial art, and I find this practice very enjoyable and beneficial for a variety of reasons. But simply feeling has the problem that we don't always realize how much we project our reality onto our body itself. Another approach, if we realize we can't escape our ideologies, we should at least try to own them. When we make a comment or follow a line of thinking, we should acknowledge the ideological influences behind them and not attempt to present them as truth to ourselves or to others. We should qualify our statements as much as possible. This can help us bounce from one viewpoint to another. If we get comfortable doing this, we can realize their provisional nature and not get too attached to any one, allowing us to adapt our view as needed. In a previous video, I talked about general semantics and the technique of writing, speaking, and thinking in E', that is, without using the verb to be in any form. This can help reprogram your thinking in useful ways, which I discuss more in that video. I have a certain fondness for these kinds of exercises. You can find many of them in Robert Anton Wilson's lectures and books. I also highly recommend Catherine Maccoun's On Becoming an Alchemist, which gives a very accessible, self-help style introduction to magic and alchemy. If we don't go about the task, what happens to us? Well, we risk becoming like the Jordan Petersons of the world. What the author of the anonymously written Meditations on the Tarot called a man of the harvest, as opposed to a man of the spring. We become too wedded to our old models and can't create new ones. The man of the harvest only values the fruits of thinking, but despite what he may claim, he does not appreciate the process that creates these fruits, nor does he appreciate the necessity of setting out to try new things. he can only look to the past, not the future. The lobster, stuck in a stagnant pool, clinging to pearls of wisdom, unable to create or gather any wisdom of his own. One last thing. I realize that some will point out that the reality tunnel understanding is itself a reality tunnel. Yes, it is hard to escape this stuff. Our means of understanding the world can help as much as hinder us. That realization has very much inspired the Cretan's paradox in the name of this channel. We also should realize that if we apply this approach sloppily, it can push us towards relativism or detached complacency. So, like any reality tunnel, it has drawbacks of its own. Okay, I think I have loaded this video with enough to think about. So thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you really like what I do, please contribute to my Patreon or make a PayPal donation. I also have some t-shirts for sale. They feature the major arcana of the Marseille Tarot deck that you find decorating my channel. For this video, I have used the moon. I have links in the description. I'm Greg Belvedere. Remember, all generalizations are stupid, so never speak in absolutes. See you next time.
Where is it writ in adamantine that semi-carnivorous monkeys can or should be capable of understanding reality? That seems to me one of the first illusions and one of the more prideful illusions of human culture, that a final understanding is possible in the first place. Better, I think, to try and frame questions which can endure, and leave off searching for answers.